All right, so we're just going to go through each of the problems. So the first 5 problems were all your order of operations. And what I would suggest you do before you go through and do any of the parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, subtract, any of that stuff, replace all of your variables with parentheses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 4 plus 1 plus, let me write this on part of the board that's a little more cooperative, 4 plus 1 plus, and then C times B. So I'll use red for B, so B is 10, and then I'm going to use green for C, so that's a negative 10. Okay? So when we do this, now we're going to follow the order of operations once we get everything plugged in. The first thing we do is we look at our parentheses. Now, parentheses just means that if there's anything inside the parentheses that can be simplified, we have to do that first. So if there's any adding or multiplying or subtracting, anything inside parentheses, we have to do that first, okay? We don't have that here because inside each of these parentheses are just a single number. So now we do exponents. We don't have any exponents, so then we go to multiply and divide. That's that right there. I'm just recopying everything else. I know you could probably, everybody can do 4 plus 1 and write down 5, but I'm just doing one thing at a time. Negative 10 times 10 gives you negative 100. So you can write plus a negative 100, or you can just write minus 100, like I did there. Now we're going to keep going left to right, because all we have left are addition and subtraction. So I'm doing this left to right. So 4 plus 1 gives me 5 minus 100. There's only one thing left to do. 5 minus 100 is negative 95. Okay, so check your answer on number 1. You should have a negative 95 for that one. Okay? All right, I'm going to keep moving. Next one, 5 minus, I'm replacing J and K with parentheses, and then I will plug in my numbers here in the next step. So J is negative 1, and K is 2. So now remember, right here we have a double negative. We can't always change a double negative to a positive. All right, there are 2 times when we can't do that. One time is if you see an exponent. So if there was an exponent right here after this negative 1, you would have to do that first. Okay? And the other option, or the other case when we can't just change a double negative to a positive, is if there's an absolute value. So for example, if I had 5 minus the absolute value of negative 1, we can't just change both of those negatives to positive and say that it's 5 plus 1. Because the reason is, this right here would become positive 1. So we would have 5 minus 1, which would give you 4. Okay? Those are the 2 things that you need to look for. Now, in this problem, we don't have either of those. So we can just go through and change this double negative to a positive. All right? But before you change a double negative to a positive, you have to make sure you double check for either of those things, either exponents or absolute value. Okay? So now, once we have this done, now we're going to go through our steps of adding, subtracting, multiply, divide, whatever, do them in the correct order. So up next is multiply. So that's 1 times 2. So I'm going to bring down the rest of it. 5 plus 1 times 2 is 2. Minus 2. Now you want to make sure that you keep going left to right. In this case, 2 minus 2 is 0. We will end up with 5 for the answer, but I'll show you an example in a later problem where if we did that, you would end up making a mistake and you would get the wrong answer. So you always want to make sure that you're in the habit of working left to right. So 5 plus 2 is 7, and then 7 minus 2 gives you 5. Okay? Any questions there? All right, next. We got a bunch of y's and z's. This one is a very straightforward problem. Oops, I forgot my plus sign. We got y plus y plus z plus z. So we go through and plug them in. Y is 2, so I have a 2 and a 2. Z is 1, so I have 1 and a 1. And this problem is a very basic, straightforward, just go through and add up all the terms. But like I said, I'm doing one thing at a time. I'm going to go left to right. So 2 plus 2 gives me 4. Plus 1 plus 1. Move that down a little bit. Next up, again, still going left to right. 4 plus 1 is 5. Plus 1. One last thing to do here, 5 plus 1 gives you 6. Okay, so always make sure that you're working left to right when you get down to either multiplying and dividing or adding and subtracting. Remember, those are done at the same step, just left to right. Okay? And it's either the next one or the one after that where I'll show you where the mistake is if you don't do it like that. All right, it's not this one, it's the next one. So, absolute value of x minus z plus y. So we got 3 variables here. X is 9, so plug 9 in there. Y is 2, so plug 2 in there. And z is 7, so we plug 7 in there. Okay? If you remember your order of operations, there is no variable, or I'm sorry, there is no letter that says when to do absolute values, right? Parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, subtract. Absolute value is not in there at all. But the absolute value stuff is done at the same step as your parentheses. So this always has to be done first. So inside the absolute value, 9 minus 7 gives me 2. And probably one of the most common mistakes that I always get for absolute values is that people always think that absolute value is just going to change the sign, so it's going to make it a negative 2. You have to remember, absolute value is a distance. It's a function that asks you, how far is this number away from 0? So that's why absolute values always have to be positive. Okay? Now it's talking about the number inside, so when we take 2 out, it's going to be a positive 2. Doesn't mean your overall answer is negative, or I'm sorry, your overall answer can't be negative. But it just means that the stuff inside the absolute value bars has to be positive. So 2 plus 2, add those together, and we get 4. Okay? Next one. So now we have z plus y minus 9 plus z. So let's plug them in. Y is negative 9. Z is negative 1. So I'm going to rewrite this because this looks kind of messy to me, adding a negative. That's the same thing as subtracting. So minus 9, minus 9. Adding a negative 1 is the same thing as subtracting 1. So the next step here, don't write this down. I'm going to show you an incorrect step that I see happen a lot. People will say, well, negative 1 minus 9 is negative 10. 9 minus 1 is 8. So 8 minus 10 is negative 18. And that's wrong, because when you start to work with multiple things at the same time, you're not working left to right, and that's when mistakes happen. This part right here is not equal to negative 8. Okay, so that's where the mistake would be. So let me start this over, and we'll just do it left to right. So negative 1 minus 9, that part I did write down correctly. That's a negative 10. Minus 9 minus 1. Keep going left to right. Negative 10 minus 9 is a negative 19. Negative 19 minus 1 is negative 20. Okay, so although it's kind of close to what I had up there incorrectly before, That is the correct way that you need to do those. Okay, so again, just make sure you're always working left to right. Just take them two at a time, and then, just go through and just take your time. What was that, number 5? Any question on number 5? And that is the last of those order of operation ones. So any questions on any order of operations? Okay. So up next, we have a average. Does anybody remember, how do you find the average of numbers? Like if I give you, there's 15 numbers here. If I give you 15 numbers, how do we find the average of those numbers? Does anybody remember that? Alexis? Exactly. We add up all the numbers. So we break out our calculator and we start adding them. 7 plus 5 plus 9 plus 5 plus 6 plus 6 plus 7 plus 5 and blah, 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 blah. So you add them all together and you should get 88. When you add up all those numbers, you should get 88. Okay? And then to find the average is we divide by how many numbers we just added. So there's 15 numbers there. So we're going to do 88 divided by 15. Round to the nearest tenth, which means 1 decimal place. And you get 5.86 repeating. Rounded to 1 decimal place gives you 5.9. Any questions on that? I know it's not something we did, but it is something that you've seen that before in middle school at some point, 6th, 7th, 8th grade. Any questions on that? All right, now we're going to do some square roots. Remember, if you see simplify the square root, this should be a key that we're not going to plug this in our calculator and just write down the decimal, right? This is not what we do. If it says to approximate or estimate, that's exactly what we do. We take our calculator, we do -3 square root of 12, we hit enter, we write down the decimal, and we're done. But if it says to simplify, we have to go through and do this with a factor tree and pull out a pair. So 12 has 2 options. You can either start with 2 and 6, like I'm going to do, or you can start with 4 and 3. It does not matter. You get the same answer. But remember, you do not have to go down to prime numbers. You just have to go to the point where you find a pair. So if I have 2 10s, I take a 10 out. If I have 2 8s, I take an 8 out. Okay, we don't have to go through and take 8 down to 2 and 4, and then 4 down to 2 and 2. As soon as you get a pair, you take that number out. Okay? Now we don't have a pair yet, so we do have to go one step further. 6 is 2 and 3. So now I got a pair of 2s. I can take a 2 out. The 3 does not have a pair, so that stays underneath by itself. But then also, don't forget, we had a number out front here that still has to be there. We can't forget about that -3. That's still part of our answer. Multiply. -3 times 2 is -6. Square root of 3 for your final answer. Okay? Does anybody have any questions on that one? Again, just make sure you're doing your factor tree. Any pair, you take one out. All right, next one, same thing. You have 2 options for 45. Okay, you have 2 options for 45. Probably the most common one would be 5 and 9. But you can also do 3 and 15. If you recognize that, you can take 3 and 15. We don't have a pair yet, so we keep going. 9 is 3 and 3. Now I have a pair. So I got a pair of 3s. I take that out. 5 is left by itself. That stays underneath. We also had this 4 out front that stays out front. 4 times 3 is 12. Square root of 5. Final answer. So there's 2 square root problems. Any questions on that, Mr. Freeman? Yeah, you want me to stop up next period? Okay. 12 square root of 5. Any questions on that one? Okay. Any questions on square roots? Because those are the only 2 on here. Okay, next one. Now this, see this square root of 5, because we're ordering these, and again, make sure you read them. This is from greatest to least. Okay, it's not least to greatest. I know a lot of times our brain wants to fill that in, least to greatest, but that's not what we have here. So this square root of 5, we will enter in our calculator and get a decimal, because if we're ordering a set of numbers, we have to have them as a decimal. Okay, so first up, negative pi. If we round this, negative 3.1416, it's 159, but we'll round it to 4 decimal places. That's plenty. Negative square root of 5 is negative, I don't remember, 2.236, I think. What's the absolute value of negative 2? Alexis? Just 2, right? Absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And then negative 2.22, it's already as a decimal, so we don't need to worry about that one. Okay? When we put these in order from greatest to least, make sure you go back to the original. So we're not going to put negative 3.14159 or whatever. We're going to put negative pi. So the biggest number that we have here is the only positive number, which is 2. Next, when we're looking at the biggest negative number, remember that your biggest negative number is actually the smallest number that has a negative sign in front of it. So what I mean here is the smallest number with a negative in front of it is negative 2.22. Sorry, I told you not to do that and I did it anyway. Absolute value of negative 2. So next, negative 2.236, negative square root of 5. And then the last one, the smallest number here is negative 3.1 blah, 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 negative pi. So that's your answer there. Any questions on 9? All right, number 10 was not really something that we had talked about or anything. It was just kind of like a random question that we wanted to throw in there. So if you have an old-fashioned clock, kind of like the one I have up there with all the math symbols on it, this is a good example for this because that one actually is broken. That the hour hand is always at 6. It's like it doesn't connect to anything, so it always just hangs there. So if you have a broken clock, how many times a day is it correct? How many times each day? 2 times, right? At the AM and PM. So how many times? You could say 2 times or twice or whatever. 2 times each day it would be correct. And again, that was just kind of like a random question we threw in there at the end. So do you have any questions at all about order of operations, simplifying square roots, or ordering numbers? Any of that stuff? Okay, so tomorrow, or not tomorrow, the notes for today